People always say trust is the foundation of a marriage, but what they don't tell you is how trust can blind you. I didn't marry Hannah thinking I'd ever have to question her. For 6 years, I built a life around her and our little girl, Emily, believing we had everything. But looking back now, the cracks were there all along. I just refused to see them. Maybe I didn't want to. Hannah had always been outgoing. Early on, I loved that about her. Her energy, her confidence, the way she could light up a room. But somewhere along the way, her nights out started to feel different. Fridays were girls' nights, she said, but those Fridays started to spill over into Saturdays, and then Wednesdays. I need my space, she'd say, brushing me off if I asked. And when she started skipping family milestones, like my grandfather's funeral, it felt like a slap in the face. Work couldn't wait, she claimed. Work? My grandfather helped raise me, and she couldn't show up for me? For our family? I tried to let it go, told myself she'd make it up to me somehow. But a moment from that weekend stuck with me. Emily, our 3-year-old, has this way of cutting straight to the truth with her innocent questions. We were in the car, heading home after the funeral, and I was strapping her into her car seat. That's when she looked at me with those big, wide eyes and said, "Daddy, why doesn't Mommy love us anymore?" I froze. For a second, I didn't know what to say. "Honey, of course she loves us," I said, keeping my voice calm. But even as I said it, the words tasted like a lie. I tickled her little foot to make her giggle, buying myself time to recover. She laughed and kicked like always, but her question stayed with me the entire drive home. If Emily was noticing something, how long had I been ignoring it? When we got back, the sun was dipping below the horizon, and the house felt too quiet. Hannah was upstairs at her mirror, putting on makeup. The smell of her perfume hung heavy in the air, sharp and unfamiliar. "You're heading out again?" I asked, leaning against the door frame. My tone was sharper than I meant, but I didn't care. She didn't even look at me. "You know, I always meet the girls on Fridays." I stepped closer, crossing my arms. "It's not just Fridays, Hannah. It's Wednesdays, Saturdays, Sundays sometimes. What's going on?" That made her pause. She set her mascara down and turned to face me, her expression a mix of annoyance and disbelief. "John, don't start this again. I work hard all week. I deserve time for myself." The nerve of her. "Yourself? What about Emily? What about me? You couldn't even make time for Grandpa's funeral." Her eyes flashed with irritation. "Don't guilt me, John. You know how important work is right now." "No, I know how important everything else seems to be to you. Just not us." I took a step closer, lowering my voice, but keeping it firm. "Emily asked me today if you loved us. You want to tell me what I'm supposed to say to her?" For a second, I thought I saw something flicker in her eyes. Guilt, maybe? Regret? But it was gone as fast as it came. "Of course I love you both," she said, reaching out to touch my arm. Her words were soft, her smile almost convincing. "You're imagining things." I wanted to believe her. For Emily's sake, I wanted so badly to believe her. But something about the way she said it, the way she didn't meet my eyes, told me all I needed to know. That night, after Emily was asleep, I sat in the living room staring at the photos on the mantel. Our wedding day, Emily's first birthday, a trip we took to the beach last summer. It hit me then. The woman in those pictures wasn't the one upstairs anymore. The woman I married wouldn't brush off her family like it didn't matter. The thought gnawed at me, but I wasn't the kind of man to sit around waiting for answers. I needed to know what was going on, and I wasn't going to wait for her to tell me. The next morning, before Hannah woke up, I went down to the basement and flipped the switches on a little device I hadn't used in years. A leftover from my work days, a surveillance system I'd installed to monitor the house phones and any nearby signals. Legal? Maybe not. But I wasn't in the mood to split hairs about ethics. At the office, I called Dave, my head of security, and the one guy I trusted with something this personal. "I need you to do something for me," I told him. "Everything okay?" he asked, his voice cautious. "No," I said flatly. "I think Hannah's cheating." Dave didn't sugarcoat it. "You're sure?" "I will be," I said. "I need you to dig into her work hours, her phone, whatever you can find." Quietly. Dave nodded. "You got it." By the end of the week, I had my answer. The recordings picked up a name, Ryan. The same name came up again and again, in tones I hadn't heard from Hannah in years. The kind of tone that made my blood boil. GPS logs showed repeated trips to the same motel, always late at night, always on the nights she was supposed to be with the girls. That night, I sat at my desk, staring at the printouts and recordings Dave had sent me. My hands clenched into fists as I read her messages to him. Playful, flirtatious, and sickeningly familiar. I wasn't devastated. I was angry. Furious. She'd gambled with our marriage, with our family, for what? Some thrill? Some other guy? I didn't feel like a man who just lost everything. I felt like a man ready to take back control. I picked up the phone and called Dave. "We're going all in," I said. "I want to know everything." When you start digging into someone's life, it's hard to know what you'll find. A part of me hoped I'd been wrong, that Hannah wasn't lying, and there'd be nothing to uncover. But the part of me that knew better wasn't surprised when the evidence came in. It wasn't just the motel visits or the name Ryan showing up again and again. It was everything, the lies, the patterns, and the way she brushed me off like I didn't matter anymore. I wasn't the kind of man to sit on my hands and wait for her to destroy what was left of our family. If she wanted to play games, I'd show her I wasn't someone to cross. The first thing I learned from Dave's team was just how much effort Hannah was putting into keeping this hidden. Her phone records told the story plain as day. In the past 6 months, calls to Ryan went from an occasional chat to daily contact, sometimes multiple times a day. Most of the calls came at times she knew I wouldn't be around, early mornings when I was out running, or late at night when I was working in the basement gym. GPS logs painted the rest of the picture. The low-cost motel on the edge of town? She'd been there at least twice a week for months, always during times she claimed to be out with her friends. Dave didn't stop there. He had contacts everywhere, and within a week, his team had gathered eyewitness accounts from Hannah's co-workers and even hotel staff. People at her office remembered her and Ryan getting close at a seminar in Chicago earlier that year, and the hotel staff remembered them well enough to confirm they weren't exactly subtle. It didn't take much convincing to get them to spill. When I got the full report, I didn't feel heartbroken. I felt insulted. This wasn't just betrayal. It was arrogance. She thought I wouldn't see it, that I wouldn't figure it out. One night, after putting Emily to bed, I sat at the dining table going over everything. Phone records, text messages, credit card statements. The text logs were the worst. Flirty, suggestive messages that made my stomach churn. She even called him babe. I clenched my fists so tight my knuckles turned white. I wanted to confront her right then and there, but I knew better. If this was going to end, it wasn't going to be a messy argument in the middle of the night. I wanted her caught, exposed. That's when Dave called with something new. "We got the Chicago seminar covered," he said. "Photos, witness statements, even a couple of video clips. Want me to send it over?" I paused. "No, keep it for now." "You sure? It's pretty damning." "I'm sure," I said. "Let's see what else we can dig up." A few days later, Dave's team struck gold. They cloned Hannah's phone. Every text, call, and voicemail was forwarded to me in real time. I didn't even have to guess where she was anymore. I could track her every move. That's when I saw the plan unfold. Hannah and Ryan were meeting up that Wednesday at their usual spot. The text left no doubt about their intentions. "I'll see you at 7, Ryan wrote. "Can't wait," she replied, adding a winking emoji that made my blood boil. I decided I wasn't going to sit back this time. I called Dave. "Set it up," I said. "You want us there?" Every angle, I confirmed. The day of their meeting, I told Hannah I had a late-night meeting at work. She barely looked up from her phone, muttering, "Okay, have fun." I didn't bother replying. By 6:45 p.m., Dave and his team were in place, cameras rolling from the motel parking lot. I waited in a car a block away, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly it felt like I might snap it in half. At 7:03, her car pulled into the lot. She stepped out in a short skirt and heels, looking more dressed up than she ever did for me these days. Ryan arrived moments later. They didn't waste time. Arms wrapped around each other, they kissed in plain sight before heading inside. I stared at the live feed on my phone, feeling equal parts disgust and rage. The rest played out exactly how I expected. Inside the room, one of Dave's hidden cameras captured it all. She didn't even try to hide her excitement as she laughed, kissed him, and fell onto the bed. I couldn't watch the whole thing. I turned it off, my mind already racing ahead to what I'd do next. I wasn't going to confront her at the motel. That would give her a chance to control the narrative. No, I wanted this to hit her where it hurt. Over the next few days, I met with my lawyer, Mike. He was blunt. "This is about as open and shut as it gets," he said, flipping through the evidence I'd handed him. "We'll file for divorce, full custody of Emily, and limit her access to joint assets. With what you've got here, the judge won't hesitate." "And the house?" I asked. "It's yours," Mike said. "She'll be lucky to get visitation rights after this." That was all I needed to hear. By Friday, everything was in motion. Dave's team had compiled enough evidence to blow this thing wide open, and Mike had already filed the divorce papers. When Hannah came home that night, I was waiting for her in the living room. She looked surprised to see me there. "You're home early," she said, slipping off her shoes. "Sit down," I said, my voice colder than I'd ever heard it. "What's going on?" she asked, her tone wary. I didn't answer. Instead, I set a folder on the coffee table and opened it to the first photo, her and Ryan at the motel. Her face went pale. "Explain this," I said. For a moment, she didn't speak. Then, her excuses started pouring out. "It's not what it looks like," she stammered. "He's just a friend." "Don't insult me," I snapped. "I know exactly what it is." She tried to backtrack, to downplay it, but I wasn't having it. "I have everything," I said, my voice steady. "Texts, videos, witness statements. Do you have any idea what this is going to cost you?" Her expression shifted from shock to anger. "You had me followed? Don't try to turn this around on me," I said. "You did this. You threw our family away for him." She opened her mouth to argue, but I cut her off. "We're done, Hannah. The divorce is already in motion. You'll be hearing from my lawyer." That night, as I tucked Emily into bed, she asked, "Is Mommy coming to say goodnight?" I paused, swallowing the lump in my throat. "Not tonight, sweetheart," I said softly. "But I'm here, okay? I'll always be here." As she drifted off to sleep, I sat by her bedside, promising myself I'd do whatever it took to protect her from this mess. Hannah could destroy her own life if she wanted, but she wasn't going to destroy Emily's. This was far from over. But one thing was certain. I wasn't going to let Hannah walk away from this without consequences. Hannah didn't know it yet, but she was walking into a storm. I'd been patient, deliberate, and measured, but now, the time for restraint was over. It was a Wednesday evening, and Emily was already asleep upstairs. Hannah came home later than usual, wearing that same fake cheerfulness she'd been using for months. "Hey," she said casually as she walked through the door, dropping her bag by the table. She didn't notice I was already standing in the living room, a thick folder in my hand. "Have a seat," I said, my voice calm, but leaving no room for argument. She stopped mid-step, her eyes narrowing. "What's this about?" "Sit down," I repeated, pointing to the armchair. The ice in my tone must have reached her, because she didn't argue. She dropped into the chair, crossing her arms defensively. "You want to tell me where you've been tonight?" I asked. "John, I told you I was out with the girls." "Don't." I cut her off. My voice was sharp now, cutting through her excuses like a knife. "Don't lie to me, Hannah. Not again." She blinked, caught off guard, but quickly recovered. "What's gotten into you?" she demanded. I opened the folder and pulled out the first photo. It was a shot of her and Ryan standing in the parking lot of the motel. Their arms were around each other, their faces too close for it to be anything but intimate. I set it down on the coffee table in front of her. "What's this?" I asked. Her face went pale. For a moment, she just stared at the picture, her mouth opening and closing like she was searching for an excuse. I don't know what this is supposed to prove," she stammered. "Don't play dumb," I said, slamming the folder down on the table. "It's all here, Hannah. Every late-night meeting, every phone call, every lie. You think I haven't noticed you sneaking around? You think I haven't seen what you've been doing?" Her composure cracked. "You had me followed?" "You're damn right I did," I said, my voice rising. "And I'm glad I did, because now I know exactly what you've been up to. While I've been at home taking care of our daughter, you've been out with him. At motels, at work trips. Don't you dare try to deny it." She stood up, her face flushing with anger. "You had no right." "I had every right," I shouted, cutting her off. "I trusted you, Hannah. I gave you everything, and this is how you repay me? By sneaking around like a coward? Her anger turned to desperation. It's not what you think, she said quickly. Ryan and I. Stop, I said, pointing at her. Don't insult my intelligence. I've seen the texts, the photos, the videos. I know everything, Hannah. So save your breath. She slumped back into the chair, her face buried in her hands. For a moment, the room was silent except for her shaky breathing. Why, Hannah? I finally asked, my voice quieter now. Why would you do this to us? To Emily? She didn't answer at first. When she finally looked up, her eyes were red, but there was no sign of regret, only defiance. You don't understand, she said, her voice trembling. You're always working, always focused on everything but me. I felt alone. I laughed bitterly. Alone? I've been here every day, trying to make this work. You're the one who checked out, Hannah. You're the one who decided we weren't enough for you. Her jaw tightened. I didn't plan for this to happen. It just did. That's your excuse? I said, shaking my head. It just happened? You think that makes it better? You think that changes what you've done? She stood up again, her fists clenched. You don't get it, John. You don't know what it's like to feel invisible. To feel like you're just part of the furniture in your own home. Invisible. I snapped. You think I don't know what it's like to feel invisible? To come home every night to a wife who barely looks at me? To watch my daughter wonder why her mom doesn't care anymore? Don't you dare make this about me, Hannah. This is on you. For a moment, we just stood there, staring at each other. Then, finally, she broke the silence. So what now? She asked, her voice hollow. Now, I said, pulling another stack of papers from the folder. Now you deal with the consequences of your actions. I handed her the divorce papers. She stared at them like they were a foreign language. You can't be serious, she whispered. I've never been more serious, I said. You'll hear from my lawyer in the morning. As of today, you have no access to our accounts, no claim to this house, and no contact with Emily. The courts will decide the rest. Tears filled her eyes, but I didn't care. I'd spent months trying to make sense of her behavior, trying to give her the benefit of the doubt. I wasn't going to waste another second on pity. You've made your choices, Hannah, I said, my voice cold. Now you live with them. That night, I stayed up long after she left. Emily was still fast asleep upstairs, and I sat in the darkened living room, staring at the empty chair where Hannah had been. My anger hadn't faded, but something else was creeping in now. Relief. I'd done what I needed to do. I'd protected myself, my daughter, and our future. And no matter what happened next, I knew one thing for sure. Hannah would never hurt us again. But the battle was far from over. The divorce proceedings, the custody fight, it was all ahead of me. And if Hannah thought she could wiggle her way out of this with excuses and crocodile tears, she was in for a rude awakening. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was about Emily. And for her, I'd fight like hell. The days after the confrontation were relentless. The truth was out, and the betrayal no longer lived in shadows. I knew I had to act fast, not just for myself, but for Emily. Hannah's actions had ripped apart the foundation of our family, but I wasn't about to let her choices dictate our future. If she thought I'd sit back and let her walk away unscathed, she didn't know me at all. Early the next morning, I met with Mike, my lawyer. His office smelled like coffee and leather polish, and the stack of evidence on his desk told me he'd already reviewed everything. This is solid, he said, leaning back in his chair. We have more than enough to move forward. Custody, financial protections, even claims of marital misconduct. This case practically writes itself. I nodded. I'm not here to drag it out. I want Emily safe, the house secure, and no access to joint accounts. Mike's mouth tightened into a thin line. With the evidence you've provided, that's realistic. The courts won't look kindly on her behavior, especially with a child involved. But John, be prepared. She might fight back harder than you expect. Let her try, I said. By that afternoon, the wheels were in motion. Every joint credit card was canceled, and our shared bank accounts were frozen. Mike ensured that Hannah received her legal share, but the rest was safeguarded for Emily and me. Hannah's name was removed from the mortgage and utilities, leaving no room for manipulation. While Mike handled the legal side, I worked with Dave to finalize the logistics. Movers arrived at the house to pack up Hannah's belongings, loading everything into a storage unit under her name. By the time she returned that evening, the locks had been changed and a new security system was installed. She called 3 times that night, leaving voicemails that alternated between pleading and furious. I didn't answer any of them. 2 days later, the lawsuit against Ryan was filed. Dave's team had traced him to his downtown office, where my lawyer served him with legal papers for alienation of affection. It wasn't just a symbolic gesture, it was a calculated move. Ryan's wife, Kelly, had already filed for divorce, and she was more than willing to provide damning evidence of his behavior. Together, our lawyers built a case that left no doubt about his role in the destruction of my marriage. Through it all, my focus was on Emily. I knew she could sense the changes, even if she didn't understand them yet. She clung to me more than ever, asking fewer questions about Hannah, but refusing to let me out of her sight for too long. To give her some stability, I adjusted my work schedule, setting up a daycare in my office where she could stay close during the day. It wasn't just for her, it was for me too. Evenings were ours alone. I kept her routine steady. Breakfast together, bedtime stories, and our little games of hide and seek. Those moments became the center of my world, a small but steady reminder of what I was fighting for. Hannah wasn't ready to let go. A week after being served with divorce papers, she showed up at my office, unannounced. She looked disheveled, her hair pulled back hastily, dark circles under her eyes, a far cry from the polished woman I once knew. "John," she started, her voice trembling. "We need to talk." I didn't even look up from my desk. "There's nothing to talk about." "Please," she pressed, stepping closer. "I know I messed up, okay? I know what I did was wrong. But I can't lose Emily. I can't lose you." I stood, finally meeting her gaze. "You already lost us, Hannah. You lost us the second you decided your affair was more important than your family." Tears welled up in her eyes, but I didn't feel any sympathy. "I wasn't thinking straight," she said. "I got caught up in something I didn't understand." "Don't," I interrupted, my voice firm. "Don't stand there and pretend you didn't know what you were doing. You made your choices, Hannah. Now you have to live with them." She tried to argue, but I cut her off. "This isn't about you anymore. It's about Emily, and I'll do whatever it takes to protect her from the fallout of your selfishness." Hannah left without another word, her shoulders slumped in defeat. I watched her go, my resolve only strengthening. 2 weeks later, we had our first court hearing. Mike presented our case with precision, laying out the evidence methodically. The judge didn't take long to make an initial ruling. Temporary full custody of Emily was granted to me, with Hannah allowed only supervised visits. It was a small victory, but it was enough to give me hope. Hannah's reaction was predictable. She called that night, sobbing into the phone. "Please, John," she begged, "don't take Emily away from me. She's my daughter too. You should have thought about that before you tore this family apart." I said coldly, "This isn't about punishing you, Hannah. It's about what's best for Emily. And right now, that's keeping her away from you." She tried to argue, but I hung up. There was nothing left to say. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of legal proceedings and adjustments. Hannah's attempts to reconcile grew more desperate, but I wasn't interested in her excuses. She reached out to friends and family, painting herself as the victim of a controlling husband. But the evidence was overwhelming, and most people saw through her lies. Meanwhile, I focused on building a new normal for Emily and me. The daycare in my office became a hit, not just for her, but for other employees who brought their kids. It gave me peace of mind, knowing she was close and cared for. Evenings were our sanctuary. Emily smiled more, laughed more, and began settling into our new routine. She still asked about Hannah occasionally, but the questions became less frequent. One night, as I tucked her in a bed, she looked up at me with her big, trusting eyes. "Daddy, are we going to be okay?" I smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "We're going to be better than okay," I said. "I promise." The road ahead was still long, but for the first time in months, I felt like we were moving towards something better. Hannah's world was beginning to crumble, but she was determined to claw her way back into Emily's life and mine. Despite the court ruling and the mountain of evidence against her, she kept pushing. Every week, there was a new attempt, a new excuse, a new story to tell anyone who would listen. I wasn't surprised. Hannah had always been persistent when she wanted something. But this time, she wasn't dealing with the man who used to bend over backward for her. She was dealing with someone who had seen the truth and wasn't about to fall for her lies again. Her first move was to appeal the court's decision. Her lawyer filed a motion to revisit custody arrangements, arguing that she was still a fit mother despite her mistakes. I knew it was coming, and so did Mike. She's trying to shift the narrative, he said during one of our meetings. She wants the judge to see her as a victim, not a perpetrator. That's not going to happen, I replied. Not with everything we've got. Mike smiled grimly. Exactly. But it does mean we need to stay vigilant. She's desperate, and desperate people can do reckless things. 2 weeks before the next court hearing, Hannah showed up at Emily's daycare unannounced. It was a Friday afternoon, and I had stepped out of the office for a meeting. By the time I got back, the daycare director was waiting for me with a concerned expression. She came here? I asked, my jaw tightening. She tried to take Emily, the director said. But we knew the situation and told her she couldn't without your permission. She got upset, but she left without making a scene. That was a lie, of course. The security footage showed Hannah raising her voice, insisting that she had every right to see her daughter. It wasn't until another parent intervened and threatened to call the police that she finally backed down. I called Mike immediately. She crossed the line, I said. She's building a case, Mike replied. She's going to argue that you're keeping Emily from her unfairly. We'll add this to the file. It only strengthens our position. Still, it rattled me. Hannah had ignored the court order, and that made her unpredictable. I decided to increase security at the daycare and at home. Dave's team installed additional cameras and reinforced the alarm system, ensuring that no one could get in or out without my knowing. Hannah's next move was more calculated. She started showing up at events where she knew I'd be with Emily. A park outing, a community festival, even the grocery store. Somehow, she always managed to appear. At first, I thought it was coincidence, but it didn't take long to realize she was orchestrating these encounters. One Saturday, Emily and I were at the local park, enjoying the warm weather. She was playing on the swings, her laughter filling the air, when I saw Hannah approaching. She wore a smile that didn't reach her eyes and waved as if nothing had happened. Hi, Emily, she called out, her voice too bright. Emily hesitated, looking at me for guidance. I stepped between them, blocking Hannah's path. What are you doing here? I asked, my tone cold. It's a public park, she replied, her smile faltering. I have every right to be here. You know the court order, I said firmly. Don't test me, Hannah. She sighed dramatically, glancing at Emily. I just wanted to say hi to my daughter. Is that a crime? I didn't answer. Instead, I took Emily's hand and led her away, leaving Hannah standing there alone. That night, I told Mike about the encounter. She's testing boundaries, he said. She wants to see how far she can push before you react. Don't give her an inch. As the next court hearing approached, Hannah ramped up her efforts to sway public opinion. She started posting on social media, painting herself as a loving mother torn away from her child by an unfair system. She shared old photos of her and Emily, captioned with sentimental messages about how much she missed her. Her friends rallied around her, leaving comments like "Stay strong" and "A mother's love is unbreakable." It was all calculated, a performance designed to win sympathy and cast me as the villain. But it didn't stop there. Hannah began contacting mutual friends, spinning her version of events, and claiming I had overreacted. A few of them reached out to me, curious about my side of the story. I kept it simple. The court made its decision based on the evidence. That should tell you everything you need to know. Most of them didn't press further. They knew me well enough to trust my judgment. But a few sided with Hannah, either out of loyalty or naivety. I didn't waste time trying to convince them otherwise. The hearing finally arrived, and this time, Hannah came prepared. Her lawyer presented character witnesses who testified to her role as a loving mother before the affair. They argued that her actions, while regrettable, didn't make her unfit to parent. Mike countered with the evidence we had gathered over months. The texts, the motel visits, the neglectful behavior toward Emily. He showed the judge videos from our home security system, capturing moments when Hannah dismissed or ignored Emily entirely. The daycare incident was the nail in the coffin. The director's testimony, combined with the security footage, left no doubt that Hannah had willfully violated the court order. When the judge delivered the ruling, it was clear whose side they were on. I was granted permanent full custody of Emily, with Hannah's visitation rights limited to supervised sessions at a family center. She was also ordered to attend parenting classes and therapy as a condition for future consideration of unsupervised visits. Hannah sat silently as the ruling was read, her face pale and her hands trembling. For the first time, I saw the cracks in her defiance. She had pushed too far and lost. After the hearing, Hannah approached me in the hallway outside the courtroom. She looked at me with red-rimmed eyes, her voice barely a whisper. "John, please, I'm begging you. Don't shut me out of her life completely." I stared at her, my expression unreadable. "You did this to yourself, Hannah. I warned you. Now you have to deal with the consequences." "She's my daughter too," she said, her voice breaking. "Then start acting like it," I replied. "Stop making this about you and start thinking about what's best for her. Maybe then, someday, you'll earn her trust back. But until that day, you stay away." She didn't say anything else. She just turned and walked away, her shoulders slumped in defeat. The weeks that followed were quieter. With the court ruling in place, Hannah's attempts to disrupt our lives dwindled. She attended her supervised visits with Emily, but didn't push beyond what was allowed. I could see the strain in her during those visits, the forced smiles, the hollow laughter, but it wasn't my problem anymore. Emily, meanwhile, was thriving. She adjusted to the new routine quickly, her days filled with laughter and love. I made sure she never felt the weight of the battles being fought on her behalf. One evening, as I tucked her into bed, she wrapped her arms around my neck and whispered, "I love you, Daddy." "I love you too, sweetheart," I said, holding her close. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of peace. The road ahead wasn't without its challenges, but I knew we were moving forward together. The weeks following the final court hearing brought a strange calm, but I knew better than to trust it. Hannah had lost the battle for custody, but the war wasn't entirely over. Her visits with Emily were supervised and sparse, but she used every one of them to try and chip away at the wall between us. At first, I refused to be present during these sessions. I didn't want to see her trying to win Emily over with forced smiles and empty promises. But when Emily came home one day quieter than usual, her small face lined with confusion, I knew something had changed. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" I asked, kneeling down to her level. She fiddled with the hem of her shirt, avoiding my eyes. "Mommy said," she said, "you're mad at her." My jaw tightened. "What else did she say?" "She said she misses me," Emily whispered, "and that it's not her fault we don't live together anymore." I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the anger simmer just below the surface. I wasn't going to let Hannah use Emily as a pawn in her game. "That's not true, Em," I said, keeping my voice steady. "You're here with me because it's what's best for you. Mommy made some choices that hurt our family, but none of this is your fault. Do you understand?" Emily nodded, but the doubt in her eyes lingered. That night I called Mike. "She's using the visits to plant seeds," I told him. "It's subtle, but it's there. She's trying to turn Emily against me." Mike sighed. "It's a common tactic, unfortunately. Parental alienation. If it continues, we can take steps to limit her influence even further. But for now, keep talking to Emily. Be honest, but don't disparage Hannah. Kids are smart. They'll figure out the truth." Hannah's next move came a few weeks later, and it was one I hadn't anticipated. I was in my office, reviewing some paperwork, when Dave called. "You're going to want to see this," he said. He emailed me a video clip taken from one of his surveillance teams. It showed Hannah meeting with Ryan at a cafe downtown. They were seated at an outdoor table, leaning close, their expressions tense. At first, I thought it was just another rendezvous, another reminder of how little respect she had for boundaries. But as I watched, I realized something was off. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't touching him. In fact, she looked furious. Her hands moved animatedly as she spoke, her face flushed with anger. Ryan, on the other hand, looked defensive, his arms crossed and his gaze darting around the cafe, as if he were nervous about being seen. The clip ended with her standing abruptly, grabbing her purse and storming off. Ryan remained seated, his head in his hands. "What do you make of it?" Dave asked. I stared at the screen, my mind racing. "I'm not sure," I admitted, "but it doesn't look good for them." The answer came 2 days later in the form of an email from Hannah. It was long, rambling, and filled with more emotion than I'd seen from her in months. She admitted to the affair, though she framed it as a mistake born out of loneliness and insecurity. She claimed Ryan had manipulated her, promising her things he never intended to deliver. According to her, their relationship had soured after I filed for divorce, and their meeting at the cafe had been the final nail in the coffin. "I know I've hurt you, John," she wrote, "and I know I can't take back what I've done, but I want you to know that I've ended things with Ryan. He was never worth losing my family over. I see that now." I didn't respond. Her words might have carried weight months ago, but now they felt hollow. Ending things with Ryan didn't erase the damage she'd caused. It didn't change what she'd done to Emily. Despite my silence, Hannah didn't stop trying to reach out. She sent more emails, left voicemails, and even showed up at my office once. Each time, her tone grew more desperate. She wanted forgiveness, she said. She wanted a second chance, not to save our marriage, but to prove she could still be a good mother. It was Emily who ultimately forced me to confront her again. One evening, as I was helping her with a puzzle, she looked up at me and said, "Daddy, can Mommy come to my birthday party?" Her question caught me off guard. Emily's birthday was only a few weeks away, and I hadn't even considered inviting Hannah. "Why do you want Mommy there?" I asked carefully. "Because she's my mommy," Emily said simply. I swallowed hard, torn between my desire to protect her and my instinct to shield her from Hannah's chaos. In the end, I decided to let Emily's happiness take precedence. "I'll think about it," I said. The day of the party arrived, and I allowed Hannah to come, under strict conditions. She wasn't allowed to bring a guest, and her visit was limited to 2 hours. Dave's team was on standby in case she caused any trouble. To her credit, she behaved herself. She arrived on time, bearing a gift for Emily and a cautious smile. She spent most of the party quietly watching Emily play, occasionally joining her for games or photos. For a brief moment, it almost felt normal, like we were just two parents celebrating their child's special day. But the illusion didn't last. As the party wound down and the guests began to leave, Hannah pulled me aside. "Thank you for letting me come," she said, her voice soft. "I didn't do it for you," I replied. She nodded, looking down at her hands. "I know I can't undo what I've done," she said, "but I want to make things right. For Emily. She deserves better than this." "She does," I agreed. "I'm going to keep trying," she said, meeting my eyes. "Even if you don't believe in me, I'll prove I can be better." I didn't respond. Words meant nothing to me anymore. Only actions did. That night, as I tucked Emily into bed, she wrapped her arms around my neck and whispered, "Thank you for letting Mommy come." I kissed her forehead. "Anything for you, sweetheart." Emily fell asleep with a smile on her face, and for the first time in months, I felt a glimmer of hope. Not for Hannah or our broken relationship, but for the possibility that Emily might come out of this stronger and happier than before. The months that followed were quieter, but not without challenges. Hannah kept her supervised visits with Emily, making a visible effort to rebuild her relationship with her. I couldn't say whether it was genuine or another attempt to sway the court in her favor, but I wasn't going to let my guard down. One evening, as Emily and I were finishing dinner, the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, and Emily's face lit up with the kind of excitement only a child can have. "Is it Mommy?" she asked, jumping up from her chair. "No," I said firmly. "Mommy knows she can't come here without permission." But when I opened the door, there she was. Hannah stood on the porch, looking anxious and holding a small bag in her hands. "I'm sorry to show up like this," she said quickly before I could say a word. "I just wanted to drop this off for Emily." I glanced down at the bag and then back at her. "You know the rules, Hannah. You can't be here." "I know," she said, her voice low, "but it's her favorite book. She's been talking about it during our visits, and I thought it might help her sleep better at night." Her words caught me off guard. It was a small thing, but it showed a level of attention I hadn't seen from her in a long time. Still, I wasn't about to let her undermine the boundaries we'd worked so hard to establish. "You need to leave," I said, my tone sharp but controlled. "If you want to give her something, you could do it during your visits or through the family center. Showing up unannounced isn't an option." Hannah nodded, looking defeated. She placed the bag on the porch and stepped back. "I'm sorry," she murmured. I didn't reply. I closed the door, locking it behind me. When I turned back, Emily was watching me from the kitchen, her small face filled with curiosity. "What was that?" she asked. "Just something for you," I said, picking up the bag and handing it to her. "But Mommy knows the rules, and we have to follow them." Emily smiled as she pulled out the book, her excitement bubbling over. "Thank you, Daddy," she said, running off to her room to read it. I stood there for a moment, watching her disappear down the hall. I wanted to believe Hannah's intentions were pure, but experience had taught me otherwise. The road ahead was still long, but moments like this reminded me why I was fighting so hard. Emily deserved a life free from chaos, and I was determined to give it to her, no matter what it took.